to do a video about how I think we can miss the thirds out in dominant chords and they sound even better. So if you are a student of jazz, you probably come across this concept which is known as guide tones, and the whole thing about guide tones is they are usually thirds and sevenths. I think most people teach thirds and sevenths, and they are very good at describing the chord progressions in backcycling chord progressions. So things like autumn leaves, for instance, you know, C minor, F7, B flat, E flat, A minor, D7, G minor, that kind of thing. So the thing about that is like, you know, I can play that and it sounds good. These are just the thirds and sevenths. This is like the first like jazz guitar lesson I had, was doing that basically. So it's kind of deeply ingrained in me that all the chords have to have the thirds and sevenths. You know, and if they don't, they're somehow incomplete or missing, right? And I would definitely also recommend anybody to try this out. But what I realised actually, and again, like this is to do with people like Peter Bernstein, but Peter Bernstein gets this from Monk, Bud Powell. I've also noticed Barry Harris doing it. Is that often left-hand jazz piano voicings are just like really simple, like the sort of things you hear Bud Powell play is often just a seventh. So you might play that for the first chord of Autumn Leaves. You might just play root and seventh, you know, this is C and B flat. And then like, this is quite a nice one, this is just the third and seventh, so this is a guide tone thing. Third and seventh, B for F, and then like that kind of thing. Right? So I'm really just playing like, either it's the root and seventh or the fifth and third of a chord. Very, very simple. This is something that Kurt Rosenwinkel's talks about. There's another channel, can't remember the name of it, very good jazz channel, where he's talking about these simple voicings. And they are really handy because they sit low on the guitar. Kind of a question and answer, call and response, soloing and comping dynamic between your two hands. So that's really handy. I mean, that's gold dust. Yeah, you can play either of those 37. You know, find it very useful for solo guitar as well. You know, for instance, I was doing something like that for the arrangement that I did of Easy Living, for instance. You know, if you go and watch that. So this is like quite a big deal to me. Now the other thing is that when I went for my lesson with Peter Bernstein, it's kept me going for about 2 years so far. I may have another lesson at some point when I've absorbed all the information. Is he pointed out to me that, you know, if you have a dominant 13th chord, so this kind of thing, that's B flat 13, right, played like that. Now he was talking about it from the context of his beautiful Zeidler guitar, which is a very special instrument, one-off really, that he plays, which has a beautifully articulate sound. I actually played this guitar in the lesson, and it's interesting comparing the two. This guitar was a lot louder, but it has a more kind of muddy tone. Okay, so but even on this, I can appreciate if I play this as a 13th chord and miss the third out, that is a much more clean, precise, definite colour. And he said that he got this chord voicing from Monk. Okay, and you have like root 7th, flat 7, obviously 13th. In terms of how it's melodied up from intervals, you've got a minor 7th and a major 7th, so it sounds a very pungent sound, right? Septundral voicing. Okay, I mean you could come up with other septundral voicings, but this is the one. And using that as a dominant 13th voicing, again I used that in my arrangement of Easy Living, so I thought it sounded better than doing this. That sounds muddy, this sounds precise to me. Now he also pointed out that what you can do is you can add in a 9th, like that, and you get a beautiful 13th voicing that feels very, you know, very kind of clean again. It doesn't have a third in. You do this with the flat third, and you get a nice sort of 13 flat 9 sound, which is, I think, you know, one of Peter's favourite, you know, tone colours. He likes that a lot, that sound, you know, if you listen to his playing. So, and all these voicings have no third in them, and if you want a, you know, a 9th voicing, for instance, it can be a minor 9th or a dominant 9th, you can use this. Again, very useful voicing, because when melodies lie low on the guitar, you're often kind of going, oh blimey, should I put, you know, should I put an A, you know, should I put in a third? And you're scrambling around to find these voicings that just sound like rubbish. Well, this thing is actually the easiest thing is just miss out the third. And I feel a little bit embarrassed saying this because I think I was a prisoner of theory in this case, and I'm really dead set against the idea of being a prisoner of theory. You should always use your ears to govern what's going on. Theory can be a guide, it can suggest ideas and solutions to problems, but when it comes right down to it, music is about the ears and about your sensibility. And your ears will be different from somebody else's ears, and that's fine. That's what gives you a style and your own aesthetic and approach to music. I think that's really important. So yeah, that's one thing. Now, this kind of also kind of cuts into things that I've been thinking about with soloing. So, for instance, a really, really nice way that you hear people like Peter Bernstein, but also people like Tim Miller. I think it comes from McCoy Tyner originally. So it's this concept of over, and it's really a very simple concept. So you can frame it in a couple of ways. You can say over a G7 chord, you have the B flat minor pentatonic. That's a way of creating the altered dominant sound by just using a familiar fingering, right? Everybody knows the pentatonic scale. You can also think about it as being a D flat major pentatonic, same thing, same note set, right? And that bears more of a kind of relationship that you might understand theoretically with the G7 because it's a tritone away. So if you can imagine playing a major pentatonic on G7. Sorry, he wanted to play the G flat there for some reason. Okay, that's a G major pentatonic, then we do it on the D flat, we're doing a tritone substitution. Tritone substitution is the way you get into altered sounds. It's the way Barry Harris does it anyway, and it's a traditional way of doing it, I think. And that doesn't have a, if you look, it doesn't have a third net. It only has a B flat, it doesn't have a B in the key of key of C major playing over G7. So that has a much more floating kind of sound. I actually hear people like Hank Mobley, just about everybody, playing things like D flat, major, triad, just like that. Sorry, the first one I played had a B in actually. That works, but things like that, right? So I'm just playing a D flat triad, and it doesn't have a B or a B flat in. It's just a straight D flat major triad resolving to C. And that can also be used as a substitute for G7. And then this made me think about the fact that for ages I've been transcribing people like Charlie Christian and Lester Young, and I found in all their solos, very often, Django Reinhardt too, very often you hear they play they're going on a G7, they might play something like an F minor. Like that kind of thing. Sounds really nice. Or an F major for that matter. Like an F6. So, if you listen to people like Lester Young and Charlie Christian, you hear that all the time. Now, from a point of view of chord scale theory, that's kind of a little bit problematic because there's no third in that. There's no no B unless you add the sharp 11th. Which they didn't, or you can have like a what's thought of as an avoid note over the dominant chord, which is the C. But to me it sounds absolutely fine. And if you're a Barry Harris student, you'll realise that he teaches the dominant scales in their totality. He doesn't think about avoid notes over the dominant. So any chord or arpeggio that you can get from a G7, for instance, which is a G Mixolydian scale, can be used to generate lines against the G7. And that's all in the same scale, which is quite a different way of looking at it from probably the more familiar modern contemporary chord scale theory in use by many education institutions, where we like to think about the 2 and the 5 as being separate things. I find it a lot easier just thinking about them as the same thing that you can swap around, because that seems to relate to what I see in actual music. Okay, so that's a really interesting thing. Now, for me anyway, might not be to you. The other thing that I sort of really like is actually just playing on top of the G7 an E flat major triad and using that, resolving that into, in this case we're using E minor triad over to C major, because that's a nice way of getting the C major 7th sound. So if I go E flat major, so if I play this against the little shell voicing that we had from earlier, sorry, that's got 4th in it as well. It's gone a bit McCoy Tynery. It's hard to finger. Let me just see if I can do it. Yeah, there we go. That's nice. It's still quite 4thy actually. You can make it completely 4thy. That sounds a bit muddy though. So going into C major. Right? So that's a really nice little resolution. It actually sounds quite natural. Now what's interesting about that is we're resolving to B as part of the C major chord. Because of course, it's a C major 7th, right? Yeah. So if we actually give that away in the dominant chord, it just sounds a bit weak sauce, It's, okay, whatever, if we go, that sounds a bit more interesting. So actually playing the minor 3rd, or what you might even call the sharp 9 on the G7 chord, and then resolving it into the B, or the 7th in the C major, so from the perspective of the key, resolving flat 7 to 7, actually sounds really, really good, I think. And it's interesting if you go back into the history, again I talked about Lester Young and Charlie Christian, but in fact if you go back to Louis Armstrong in 1920s playing, that's actually written by his wife, Lillian Armstrong, wrote the tune Striking with Some Barbecue, and there's a beautiful Gil Evans arrangement of it as well if you want to check it out, on a new, was it New Bottles Old Wine or Old Bottles New Wine? I can never remember. His big band, there's Gil Evans' album that he did with Cannonball Adderley. It's amazing, check it out. I'll try and attach a link if I remember below. He does a version of that old Lillian Armstrong tune, and that has an unresolved major 7th, and actually it's quite common in earlier jazz. Like you can listen to things like In a Sentimental Mood, where we go, sorry, that's an 11th, that's a minor 11th chord. Ninth. This was back in the 30s, right? So they're already using upper extensions on all the chords. Now you wouldn't necessarily hear the banjo doing that, or the piano. You wouldn't hear those extensions because they'd just be in the melody. They're especially in the earlier jazz and like Louis Armstrong's time, it would just be simple triadic voicings. But then, sorry, can't sing that high. Over the top, Okay, so that existed as part of the melodic thing, but they hadn't thought about putting the two things together into the chordal instrument yet, and I think that really started happening with Bill Evans. He started putting both hands of the piano together, and we can see that influence, of course, in Jim Hall and other musicians like that. So I think that's kind of really interesting to me. It's like but the dominant thing, the thirds on dominant goes back to the fact that, well, actually, if we do this, it just gives away, like, I'm playing the 4th and the 7th, the guide tones of the dominant chord, which is, sorry, the 4th and 7th of the key, but the 3rd and the 7th of the G7, resolving to a straight E and C there. That's very Teutonic, it's very, it's Bach and Mozart on one side and Oktoberfest on the other side. It's kind of like fine, but it's a bit too obvious. And actually, if you apparently, if you go into the gospel harmonization thing, apparently they don't use the B in the key of C, so the leading note, this note. They don't use that in the accompaniments. In the harmonization. So that's why you get all these things in gospel and soul music, where instead of getting straight 2-5-1, this kind of thing, you actually get, because it's almost half of a church cadence. That's like soul music in the 1960s, right? This kind of thing. And of course, when Billy Taylor has I wish I knew what it is to be free. He uses that sound, that sus chord, because it has that churchy association. So then you have people like Wes Montgomery, of course, who were always playing F major 7th on a G7 chord, and it's kind of like that softened sound where you don't necessarily feel the need to go like, now I'm going up to the 1. That less obvious sense of tonality, I think, is quite important to 20th century music, full stop, because, you know, I mean, obviously it got assimilated into what I think of as baby boomer harmony, you know, kind of like James Taylor and Carole King and stuff like that, you know, Burt Bacharach, not Burke Bacharach, because that's not a person, and also it's quite rude. Burt Bacharach, you know, that kind of thing, that slightly floating tonality, you know. So yeah, anyway, that's something to think about. Let me know what you think